The flashing lights painted the inside of Kendra's car in streaks of red and blue, illuminating the dashboard and dancing across the reflective surface of her rearview mirror. Her grip on the steering wheel remained steady, but inside, a storm brewed. She had experienced this moment before, too many times to count, yet each time carried its own unique sting, and this one felt especially bitter. Today was supposed to mark a new beginning, her first official day as Chief of Police in Cedar View. Instead, she was pulled over, suspected of something simply because she existed in a place where people like her were often questioned. She slowed her vehicle and pulled off to the side of the quiet, tree-lined street. The neighborhood was well kept, its sidewalks lined with trimmed hedges and mailboxes with gold-plated numbers. It was a space that prided itself on order, on familiarity, on predictability. And to some, Kendra's presence disrupted all three. As she put the car in park, she took a slow breath and glanced in the mirror. Two officers were approaching, one younger, with a tense jaw and a purposeful stride. The other older, more seasoned, his eyes scanning her vehicle with suspicion as he unfastened the clasp on his holster. She rolled down the window and waited. The younger officer reached her first. "License and registration," he said curtly, without greeting or explanation. Kendra kept her hands where he could see them, resting calmly on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" she said, her tone measured, calm. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, who stepped closer. "Routine check," the senior officer replied. "There have been reports of suspicious vehicles in the area." Kendra resisted the urge to laugh. Suspicious? Of course. She knew what that word meant. It meant out of place. It meant not belonging. It meant you don't look like you live here. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, and reached into her purse. She moved deliberately, aware of their eyes on her every motion. She retrieved her wallet, pulled out her license, and handed it over. The younger officer examined it, then looked back at her. "You live in this area?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Kendra replied. "I moved here last week." The senior officer leaned forward slightly, peering inside the car. "You a lawyer?" he asked. Kendra held his gaze. "Something like that." There was a pause, one thick with meaning. She could feel their discomfort growing, even as they tried to maintain control of the situation. She could see the doubt flicker in their eyes, the way their assumptions struggled to reconcile with the reality sitting in front of them. A well-dressed black woman in a new car, calm and composed, not fitting into their predefined categories. The younger officer handed back her license, but the tension didn't ease. "Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" he asked. Kendra arched an eyebrow. "Is there a reason for that request?" "We'd like to ask you a few more questions," the senior officer said. "Standard procedure." Kendra unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She stepped out slowly, standing to her full height. She wasn't tall, but she carried herself with the kind of presence that made people pause. Her eyes, dark and direct, held both of them in a gaze that was neither angry nor fearful, just resolute. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her badge, holding it up for them to see. The effect was immediate. The younger officer's mouth fell open. The senior officer blinked, his composure cracking. "I'm Chief Kendra Morris," she said, her voice steady. "As of this morning, I oversee this department." Both officers stood in silence, their faces drained of color. The younger one looked at his partner, who was now rigid, his jaw clenched. Kendra let the moment hang, watching as the weight of it settled on their shoulders. This wasn't just about her being a superior, it was about what they had assumed. It was about every silent prejudice that had informed their actions from the moment they saw her. "You'll be reporting to me personally for the next few weeks," she said. "Every stop you make, every interaction, you'll be accountable to me." They didn't speak, they couldn't. "I suggest you think long and hard about how you conduct yourselves from now on." Finally, the senior officer found his voice. We didn't mean any disrespect, Chief. It won't happen again." Kendra nodded once, but she knew better. It would happen again. Maybe not with these two, but there were others. That was the problem. That was the system she had walked into, a structure that tolerated assumptions and rewarded silence. She turned back toward her car and got in, starting the engine with a calm hand. As she pulled away from the curb, she caught sight of the two officers still standing there, stunned. She allowed herself a long breath. She had won this round, but it wasn't about victory. It was about survival. It was about using every ounce of her position to push back against a current that had swept too many before her under its tide. Her mind replayed the interaction as she drove through the winding streets of the neighborhood. What would have happened if she hadn't revealed her badge? Would they have escalated things? Would she have been detained? How far would their assumptions have taken them before they saw her humanity? She hated those questions, hated that they had to be asked, hated that even as the highest-ranking officer in the city, she wasn't immune. The streets of Cedar View were quiet as she turned into the parking lot of the precinct. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the pavement. Today was her first day, the beginning of a role she had worked her entire life to reach. And already, the message had been sent. You don't belong. But Kendra had a message of her own. She stepped out of the car, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the building. Her heels clicked against the pavement with a rhythm that echoed resolve. This wasn't just a job. It was a mission. A fight she had trained for, suffered for, bled for. Inside the precinct, a few early arriving officers glanced up as she entered. Some nodded, others looked away. She could feel the shift in energy. They had heard, or they would soon. Cedar View's new chief was not here to play politics. She was here to change things, and change never came quietly. As she settled into her office, placing the badge on the desk before her, Kendra allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her reflections stared back at her from the dark surface, strong, tired, determined. She thought of the officers she had just encountered, their faces, their words, their disbelief. She had dealt with men like them her whole life, but this time was different. This time she had the power to hold them accountable, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Because somewhere in this city, a young girl might grow up watching what happened this morning and wonder if she would ever be safe, if she could ever walk freely without being questioned, if she could dream of becoming something more without the weight of assumptions pressing down on her. Kendra wanted to make sure that girl had a different answer. The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her back to the present. She glanced at the screen. A message from the mayor. Looking forward to your address this afternoon. Welcome aboard. She smiled faintly. Welcome indeed. There was work to do, a mountain of it. But for now, she let herself remember that single moment, standing in front of those officers, badge in hand. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. The truth had done all the speaking, and it was only the beginning. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher and cast long rectangles of light through the station's tall windows, Kendra stood in front of the squad room, the eyes of every officer in the department focused on her. There was no podium, no microphone, no filter. Just her, standing beneath the wall-mounted seal of the Cedar View Police Department, with a presence that didn't need embellishment to be felt. The air in the room was thick, weighed down with a mixture of apprehension, curiosity, and barely concealed tension. Some officers sat upright, backs stiff, trying to gauge her tone before it was even spoken. Others leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, expressions unreadable. A few tapped their fingers against the sides of their belts or shifted uncomfortably, but every last one of them was silent. Kendra let the pause linger. It was important. Silence could command a room more forcefully than shouting ever could. Her eyes moved deliberately across the group, not hurried but firm. She made sure no one felt unseen. This wasn't going to be the type of address the department had grown used to. It wasn't a speech built on tradition or nostalgia. It wasn't about making allies or avoiding discomfort. It was about truth. And truth, when spoken aloud in the right room, had power. She took one step forward and began to speak. This morning, she said, her voice steady and clear, I was pulled over by two officers from this department. The tension in the room magnified instantly. Heads turned, some slightly, others sharply. A low buzz of energy, almost imperceptible, passed through the rows of uniforms. They didn't recognize me, she continued. They asked for my license and registration. They questioned whether I lived in the neighborhood. They asked me to step out of my car. They looked at me and they saw someone suspicious. Not their new chief, not a fellow officer, just someone who didn't fit their idea of who belongs in that neighborhood. She paused again, giving her words space to breathe. I didn't tell you this to embarrass them. I'm telling you this because it's not the first time something like this has happened to me. And it's certainly not the first time it's happened to someone in this town. The silence grew heavier. Some officers stared down at the floor, others sat up straighter, absorbing every word with focused attention. One or two exchanged brief glances, their expressions unreadable. Kendra kept going. If you were surprised by what I just said, then maybe that's the point, because people are surprised when they don't see the patterns, when they don't live the reality. But it's real, and it's happening right under our noses, on our streets, under our badge. She looked across the room again, and this time her voice took on a firmer edge. This behavior ends now. From this day forward, every officer in this department will be held accountable for how they engage with the citizens of Cedar View. There will be no free passes, no overlooked infractions, no, that's just how he is. Every word, every action, every decision will reflect the values we claim to uphold. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat but didn't speak. Kendra's gaze didn't waver. Some of you might think this isn't your issue, that you've never done anything wrong. Maybe that's true. But if you've stayed silent when something didn't feel right, if you've looked the other way, laughed off a comment, ignored an unfair stop, then you're part of the problem. Another pause. The silence now wasn't just tension, it was reckoning, it was realization. Kendra could see it in their eyes. A few hardened their expressions, guarding themselves. Others began to let down the defenses, just a little. You may not agree with everything I say, that's fine. But understand this, I didn't accept this role to keep things comfortable. I accepted it because change was long overdue, and I refused to sit quietly while good people are mistreated, while our oath is used to justify injustice. The room was still. Then from the back a voice spoke. What happens to the officers who pulled you over? Kendra turned her head slowly toward the speaker. A middle-aged officer with silver at his temples and a steady gaze. She nodded at his question. They'll be reporting to me directly for the next several weeks. Every stop they make will be reviewed. Not because I'm out to punish them, but because accountability is the only path to growth. She let that settle before continuing. And they won't be the only ones. We're implementing a department-wide review system. Body cam footage will be randomly audited, community reports will be taken seriously, and bias training will no longer be a one-time seminar. It'll be ongoing, required, and enforced. There was a low rustle of motion among the chairs. A few officers looked openly uneasy now. Others nodded, perhaps slowly, but with a trace of acceptance. One young woman in the second row leaned forward, her eyes filled with something that looked a lot like hope. This is your opportunity, Kendra said, to be the kind of officers this community can trust. The kind that kids don't fear when they walk home, the kind that makes their badge mean something more than authority. It makes it mean integrity. She walked slowly across the front of the room, her hands clasped behind her back. But know this, if you think bias doesn't exist, you're not paying attention. If you think you've never acted on a stereotype, you haven't looked in the mirror hard enough. We all have work to do, including me, especially me. Her voice softened just a bit. You chose this career because you wanted to serve, to protect, and I believe most of you still do. But service without introspection is hollow. Protection without justice is dangerous. She stopped in the center of the room and turned back toward the crowd. This morning, 2 officers made a mistake. A serious one. But what mattered more than their mistake was how they reacted to it when they realized who I was. Not with reflection or apology, but with fear. That tells me their concern wasn't about what they did. It was about who they did it to, and that's a problem. Kendra saw several heads bow slightly. She wasn't aiming to humiliate them, but she wasn't going to let them hide from the truth either. I'm not naive, she said. I know that some of you will push back. Some of you will grumble that the chief is too hard, too political, too focused on things that don't matter. But if dignity, fairness, and equity don't matter to you, then I don't know why you're wearing that uniform. The words cut through the room like a blade, but they didn't come with anger. They came with purpose, with care, with the weight of a woman who had endured enough to speak with authority, born of experience. Everything we do from this point forward will reflect a new standard, one that won't apologize for expecting more, one that understands that real leadership means confronting what's uncomfortable. She could feel the resistance in the room shifting, slowly, unevenly, but shifting. Even those who weren't ready to say it aloud were hearing her, some of them for the first time. If you're with me, truly with me, then prove it, not with your words, but with your actions. Prove it in the way you speak to the people you serve, in the way you treat the teenager who's walking too slowly, or the driver who doesn't look like you, or the neighbor who calls for help and expects more than suspicion. She stepped forward again, her voice quieter now but still strong. Prove it by doing the job better than it's ever been done before. A long silence followed. Kendra didn't rush to fill it. This was a moment that needed to stretch, to echo. When she finally moved, it was with slow purpose. Her steps took her past each row of officers, her eyes connecting briefly with theirs. She saw doubt, she saw fear, but she also saw something else. Possibility. The smallest seeds of change. And that was enough for now. In the weeks that followed, Kendra's name echoed across Cedar View. The incident had sparked more than murmurs and whispers. It ignited something deeper. A conversation that had long been avoided, brushed aside in favor of maintaining a fragile peace. But peace built on silence is never true peace, and now the silence had been shattered. Word of the traffic stop traveled fast. First, it made its rounds inside the department. Some officers saw it as a cautionary tale, others as a wake-up call. A few resented the attention it brought, mumbling about overreactions and making a big deal out of nothing. But most couldn't deny that something had shifted, something fundamental. The community learned about it next through whispers and conversations shared in barbershops, grocery store lines, and at PTA meetings. Then the local paper ran the story. From there, regional outlets picked it up. Headlines began to circulate. New police chief confronts racial bias in first week, and traffic stop of Chief Sparks' citywide reflection. Kendra never sought the spotlight, but she didn't run from it either. She knew public attention could be a double-edged sword, fuel for progress or a distraction from real change. So she used it wisely. She gave one interview, short and direct, not to recount every detail of what happened, but to make it clear what would happen next. "We can't fix what we refuse to face," she said calmly, her image flickering on TV screens across town, "and in Cedar View, we will face it, together." Some clapped when they heard it, others rolled their eyes, but no one could pretend they didn't hear it. Soon after, the mayor called a special session to discuss policing practices. Kendra was invited to speak, and when she did, she didn't just speak about the department. She spoke about the pain that echoed through generations of citizens. She spoke about the quiet fear that parents carried when their children left the house, and the anger that simmers when dignity is taken by someone meant to protect. She told the truth. In the room that day sat council members, business leaders, neighborhood activists, and a few skeptical voices who believed things were being blown out of proportion. But even they had to admit that Kendra wasn't just commanding the room, she was shifting it. After the meeting, changes began to roll out. Body cam policies were revised. Officers would now have mandatory quarterly reviews. Community forums were scheduled every month, with open mic sessions that allowed residents to speak directly to those who served them. Kendra didn't just attend these forums. She stood there and listened. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she just took notes, but always she made it known their voices mattered. A mentorship program was launched, pairing veteran officers with young recruits, not just to train them on procedure, but on empathy, listening, and service. Kendra made sure the curriculum included visits to schools, community centers, and even faith gatherings, not for press, but for presence. Back at the department, the cultural shift was palpable. Officers who once saw the badge as a shield were being reminded it was a symbol of service. Some struggled with it. Change never came without resistance. There were whispers of retirement, complaints about political correctness. But Kendra kept moving forward. In the break room one afternoon, she overheard two officers talking quietly. One mentioned how he'd started noticing things he'd never seen before, how people flinched when he approached, how assumptions crept into his thoughts during stops. He wasn't proud of it, but he was acknowledging it. The other officer nodded, not with shame, but with recognition. That was the beginning of something real. Community members began to reach out too. A youth organizer invited Kendra to speak at a local event. A retired teacher sent her a letter thanking her for bringing dignity back to the role. A mother who had once warned her son to avoid police at all costs now spoke of cautious hope. One day Kendra walked into a coffee shop and noticed a mural had been added to the wall. It showed children playing in front of the police station, their faces filled with joy instead of fear. It wasn't a tribute to her. It was a vision of what Cedar View could become. But Kendra knew not everyone was ready to embrace the change. She heard the anonymous complaints, saw the op-eds that accused her of turning the department into a social justice campaign. She faced a wave of internal resistance from a few senior staff who were more comfortable with the old ways. One even suggested she take a leave until things cooled off. She didn't flinch. Instead, she called a meeting with the leadership team and laid out a simple message. We are not here to protect comfort. We are here to protect people. Her tone was firm, but not cruel. She knew transformation didn't happen through threats. It happened through truth, consistency, and unwavering expectations. The backlash didn't stop, but neither did the progress. Reports of aggressive stops dropped. Citizens began filing fewer complaints. Trust, that elusive thread between power and people, began to repair itself, slowly, delicately. One evening, Kendra received a letter at her office. It was handwritten, shaky and unsure, from a teenager she had never met. Dear Chief Kendra, I saw what happened to you. My big brother had something like that happen last year, but no one listened. We thought maybe no one cared, but now we think maybe things can be different. Thank you for showing us that. Kendra read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. She didn't get into this work for praise. She did it because she remembered what it felt like to be unseen, to be doubted, dismissed, or worse, feared for no reason other than existing in a certain body in a certain place. She carried those memories not as wounds, but as fuel. Every time she sat at her desk, every time she spoke to a room full of officers, every time she stood in front of a mother with tears in her eyes, she called on that fire. She knew change was not a moment. It was a practice, an ongoing, relentless choice to do better, to expect more, to reach farther than comfort would allow. Even in moments when doubt crept in, when the weight of resistance pressed heavy against her resolve, she reminded herself why she was here. It wasn't to be the first, it was to make sure she wasn't the last. She started showing up to roll calls more often, not just to inspect, but to connect. Officers who once kept their distance now lingered after meetings, asking questions, sharing frustrations, even suggesting changes. It was slow, sometimes awkward, but it was real. A new recruit once asked her what the hardest part of the job was. She looked him in the eye and said, choosing every day to care even when it would be easier not to. He nodded, the weight of those words settling on him. That's what she wanted. Not blind obedience, not performative agreement, but understanding. As the seasons changed, so did Cedar View. The headlines faded, but the conversations didn't. The people remembered. They remembered the chief who got pulled over. The chief who didn't yell or shame, but held a mirror to the city and said, look, we can do better. And then she showed them how,